Okay, so yesterday at 4 p.m., Professor Kroll asked me to do the presentation for today. So I've had very little time to prepare this presentation. So I asked for patience if it's not as expertly crafted as an SM's presentation. When he first asked me to do it, I did not have, I think, a very good understanding of what the book was trying to say. But then once, the realization kind of hit me that I have to teach it to other people, I kind of dug deeper into the book, and I think I've gotten a better understanding, and hopefully I can impart that onto you guys. So Nessim started his presentation with a quote, and I'll do the same. The meaning of a word is its use in language. This might seem like a kind of obvious statement, but I think it's at the key of what Nongbri is trying to argue with this book, and he evokes this quote a few times during the introduction. So the introduction begins with this anecdote, which I think frames the point of the book really well. He talks about how his father was from the Khasi hills of northeastern India. And as he was studying religion, he realized that he didn't know what the Khasi word was for religion, the thing he was studying. So he asks his dad what the Khasi word is. And the word was Ka-nyam, K-A-N-I-A-M. And he did some digging, and he found out that it's not even a native word to Khasi, but it comes from the Bengali word. It's borrowed from Bengali, the word niyama, which means rules or duties. So then he concludes, it seems my father's language has no native word for religion. And I think that is, a great point that will be explored later about how we kind of take this idea of religion for granted, but it hasn't always been present. And in some cultures, you could argue it still isn't present, like Khasi, they don't really have a word for it. And then the rest of the introduction goes over the structure of the book, which is very useful for writing essays or whatever. And then he outlines the objectives of the book. So one big thing that he keeps coming back to is how in modern day, we kind of have this idea of religious in opposition to the secular. It's like a dichotomy. And this is a concept that is kind of foreign to most of human history. And it's a very modern notion that's developed very recently. And then he outlines that the approach that he's taking is a diachronic approach. So I didn't exactly know what that meant, and I looked it up. And diachronic is concerned with how something, especially language, develops over time. So this is very much an account of how we got from these words religio or the Arabic din, and we got to this modern word religion, and how we got meaning from that word. So the first chapter is called What Do We Mean by Religion? And I want to emphasize the we. This chapter is very much focused on what we say when we mean religion now. And then he has this appeal to the Wittgenstein quote from the beginning of a pragmatic approach, that religion now kind of means how we use it to mean, even if that's not exactly 100% coherent at the time. So the chapter opens on this very famous court ruling about hardcore pornography, where this where this justice ruled that he's basically not going to waste time trying to define hardcore pornography, and it's more this idea that you know it when you see it. And the author argues that that is very much how we view religion today. There may not be a 100% coherent definition, but it's this idea that you know a religion when you see a religion. So in the book, when he talks about a modern, when he says modern religion, that's what he's referring to. He's referring to this modern notion of you know it when you see it. And then he makes a very interesting point about academic definitions. So for example, we had the definition from yesterday, which is still on the board back here. And he is basically saying that these academic definitions are kind of post hoc, trying to define what we already conceptualize as religion in modern day. So he gives the example of this definition from last lecture. And then he talks about another academic who disagrees and says that things which one intuitively wants to consider as religion, like Catholicism or Islam, are excluded by this definition. So it's the idea that, like, I mean, you can agree or disagree whether or not Islam or Catholicism are excluded by this definition. I don't think it's excluded, but it's the idea that we kind of are trying to build a definition for a concept that we already have. Like the word has its meaning from how it's used. So for the bulk of the first chapter, the remainder, he makes three key points about the modern use of the word religion. So first, there's this very popular notion now that religion is this private, internal, spiritual struggle, which is opposed to the public, maybe the political. And there's this quote from a popular author now that says that like power struggles are not what religion is really about, but an unworthy distraction from the life of the spirit, which is conducted far from the maddening crowd, unseen, silent, and unobtrusive. So that's very much how religion is seen today. But the argument is that this is a very foreign idea of religion. And he has this example from a Roman court case or a legal ruling where someone defines the sacred. Things sacred are those which have been consecrated by an act of the whole people, not by anyone in his private capacity. Therefore, if someone makes a thing sacred for himself acting in a private capacity, the thing is not sacred but profane. So it's not that the spirituality is something personal and with one person, but it's a very public affair. And then the second point historically it's seen as a public affair as opposed to how it's seen now. The second point is that religion is now seen as a genus with various species underneath it. So you have the genus of religion, and then underneath you have the species, which are like Islam, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity. And what he argues is that that this conceptualization of religion makes it seem as if they're all somehow bound by the moniker of religion, but how that's not exactly very clear. And with our modern conception, of it when you see it, we don't really, it's very hard to come up with a definition that catches all religions. And this idea of genus and species is also, again, not how it's been seen historically. And then the third point is he brings up is very academic. He's appealing to religious studies scholars, and he brings up this distinction between descriptive and redescriptive. So descriptive would be you trying to describe the culture of the time using the terminology that they would use to mean the things that they take it to mean. So it would be like when we use the Latin religio, which we'll go into more, we take it to mean, we describe religion as a collection of rituals. But then redescriptive would be us applying our modern idea of religion to the past. So then we'd be saying like, oh, the religions of the past, they had the Christians, they had Jews, they had Muslims. But he's saying that this distinction is very important. And in modern academia, it's kind of been blurred. And he just wants to call attention that when you apply a redescriptive lens, but you claim to be providing a descriptive one, you kind of get very misleading ideas of what religion is. So to conclude the first chapter, he brings up this philosophical question, which I think is at the heart of the utility of this book. But he asks, do you need the word to have the thing? So the question is, as he says, does the absence of a word or phrase equivalent to religion in a language mean that the speakers of the language also lack the concept? So just because, the Romans or whatever didn't have this term religion, does that mean that that religion as we see it today didn't exist back then? And then again, his response is very pragmatic. He says that there is no use in talking about something which is beyond language in a certain time. And I'll just read the conclusion for each chapter because I think they summarize very well the main point. An especially popular way of viewing religion is as a kind of inner disposition and concern for salvation, conceived in opposition to politics and other secular areas of life. So that's that modern idea that religion is opposed to the public and the secular. In this model, religion is presumed to be a universal feature of human cultures, and the individual world religions are culturally specific examples of this phenomena of religion. Such a view is so common that many people in the modern world, I think, consider it self-evident. In this book, I argue that such a view of the world is foreign to ancient cultures, and that we can, in rough outlines, trace how this peculiar way of viewing the world developed. So, re-emphasizing our idea of religion today is not at all how it's been seen throughout history. So getting more into the meat, chapter 2 gets more into the actual argument that he's trying to build. And he talks about 4 words, mostly 3, which are commonly in modern day translated as religion. If you look at a translation, it translates as religion. So the first example he gives is kind of just to get, give you a taste for it. He talks about the Chinese word zongjiao, which is taken to mean religion. And I try this. If you go into Google Translate, you type religion, you get this zongjiao. And he says if you dig into the etymology of the word zong is derived from a pictogram of an ancestral altar. And the meaning of it is something closer to like ancestral or sectarian, of like a specific ancestry. And jiao, the second half, means teaching. So the word that we now take to mean religion is closer to something like teachings from the ancestors. And then he goes in the rest of the chapter to talk about the Latin religio, the Greek treskeia, and the Arabic din. So first for religio, religio has had a lot of meanings throughout history. When it first appeared, the book says that it was taken to mean scrupulous or showing a sense of reserve, whether it be moral reserve or some other kind of reserve. And then as time passed, it kind of got a connotation more associated with God. So it became this kind of rituals or laws. But then religio is a ritual, and then religions is not how we think of religions, but it's like a body of ritual is like the plural of rituals. And then later in Roman, in 5th century Rome, I think it said it kind of became superstition or like excessive concern with the gods. And then later on, it kind of evolves to something approximating how we use it today, even though the book argues it's still substantially different. But once you start to get a body of religio, so a group of rituals, religiones, then you can compare it to another body of rituals. And you get I think it's the writings of polymath Hugo Grotius on the truthfulness of the Christian religio. Christiana religio is one of the many religiones, but it is far from the best one. What makes it superior is that there is neither ever been any other religio in the world that has produced either honorable or excellency of reward or more absolute perfect for its precepts. So it's like comparing one body of rituals to another body of rituals. Now for the Greek treskeia, there I have a photo of Heraclitus, which is unrelated, but I have like this book of, it's a Plato reader that I have to buy for this Greek philosophy class. And that's the cover. So whenever I think Greek, I think this painting, I don't know. And it's a nice painting, But in Greek, treskeia is often the object of verb. So it's like to complete treskeia. So again, it's this idea of rituals, ritualistic practices. And then also it's used to describe like adherence to divine law. Or it can even be to non-divine law, to just human law. But for an example of divine law, it talks about Abraham's treskeia to divine authority, so his loyalty and obedience to God. And then again, once you get into the plural, you get it becomes a collection of rituals, which can then be compared to another collection of rituals, which approximates the way we use it in modern day. And then finally, for the Arabic din, this is commonly translated as faith or religion. So you have this passage. First, I'll read it like replacing the words as they're translated, and then I'll read it as just din. So it says, "This day I have perfected your religion for you, completed my favor to you. I have chosen Islam to be your faith." So that's a verse from the Quran. But then if you replace it with din, it's, "This day I have perfected your din for you, completed my favor to you. I have chosen Islam to be your din." And the origins of this word, it has almost a legal connotation. It comes from root words which mean debt and judgment. And it seems that din is more more not as much a collection of rituals like the other one, but a collection of laws which you submit to. And that goes into the meaning of the word Islam, which means to submit. So it's you submitting to the din. And then again, you have with plural, you can compare one set of laws to another set of laws. So then you kind of get closer to the conceptualization we have now, but not quite as the author says in the conclusion, which I'll read again because I think it's very, very good at summarizing what the point of those are. This exercise could continue with analysis of additional terms from other ancient cultures that one sees translated commonly as religion, such as Dharma, Tao, or Jiao. But for now, I close by simply re-emphasizing the key point about religio, treskeia, and din, to which I have alluded to multiple times. Even though all these terms come in the course of antiquity to be used in classification systems with the singular form indicating genus, so the singular form is like, din, you have a type, like a law, and then the plural meaning like a collection of laws, which then can be compared to another collection of laws. The aspects of life covered by these terms fall outside the idealized private interior realm associated with the modern concept of religion. Translating these terms as religion or conceptualizing any particular individual ancient religio, treskeia, or din as a religion is thus bound to lead to misleading practice. And then for chapter 3, he takes 4 examples of when it's taken that a modern conceptualization of a world religion was formed, and shows how it's not that simple, or it's not quite the case. I'm going to focus on these 2, the revolt of the Maccabees, which is taken to be the beginning of modern day Judaism, and then Muhammad and his earliest followers, which almost seems self-evident, the beginning of what we now consider Islam, but it's not very clear at all. So with the revolt of the Maccabees, the historical narrative, or the popular historical narrative, is that the Judaism rose to revolt against Hellenism. And you have thus the concept of, this is from a popular historian, thus the concept of Judaism was born. This is perhaps the first time in human history that religion has a name. So it's the idea that before, it was this collection of whatever, of culture, but then now they're rising against Hellenism, and now it's a concrete religion, how we conceive of it today. But what the book argues is that this term Judaism, so the German word Judaismos, it comes from, so this verb ending of izo, which in Greek formed originally during the Persian War to describe someone who defected against Greek and was showing Persian customs. So ismos denotes more the customs, or of being part of an ethnic group rather than a religious connotation. So the idea of the book is that the revolt in rising up in Judaism, what is meant is like they're rising for their ethnic customs and civil life, not for this internal spiritual thing as how Judaism is maybe conceived today. And then for Muhammad and his early followers, this one seemed very straightforward to me. I had no idea how he was gonna approach this, but the narrative has been that Islam is a self-aware religion, that it knows that other religions exist and that it's a religion against other religions, and it's called Islam, and the followers are Muslims. Like, it's very self-aware. So here's again an excerpt from a popular historian. Unlike most religious documents, the Quran shows awareness of religion as a category of phenomena, and not merely as a single phenomena. There is not just one religion, there are religions. The word used in Arabic, din, the notion of religion as a class or category in which Islam is one, and in which besides Islam there are others, seems to have been present from the advent of the Islamic dispensation. The Quran contains a number of passages in which the new religion defines itself against other religions. So again, ignoring what he says about din, which we've shown is not exactly how it should be viewed, as like din does not necessarily mean religion. And this idea that the Quran is self-aware and it's saying like, we are Islam and people who follow are Muslims is also not very clear at all, because as I said before, Islam means to submit to the law, and then Muslims means someone who submits. So a Muslim is someone who submits to the law. And if you take this very literal translation of Islam to mean the religion of Islam, then you can get some very strange translations, which the book talks about. Like, for example, Jesus says, in the Surah 352, which is in the Quran, talks about Jesus, and it says, when Jesus observed that they had no faith, he said, "Who will help me in the cause of God?" The disciples replied, "We are God's helpers. We believe in God. Bear witness that we submit to him." So if you take this literal meaning, like in this passage, submit would translate as Islam. So if you take this literal meaning, then it seems that Jesus is advocating for the religion of Islam. But that's not what's happening. He's advocating for you to submit to God, which is what Islam means. And then furthermore, there's reason to believe that Christians and Jews were considered part of this early Muslim movement. There's a very famous quote in the passage in the Quran about people of the book, which are Jews and Christians, and how they are kind of part of the Ummah, which is the Muslim community. And what the author argues is that there's reason to believe that this initial movement of Islam is just a kind of very fervent monotheism, which in fact included some Christians and Jews. So it says, the Jews of the it says, it thus seems clear that at a stage in Muhammad's movement, his community, Ummah, did include some Jews. And according to Surah 352, which is the one about Jesus, which describes Jesus' followers as Muslims submitting to Islam, suggests that some Christians were part of the community of believers as well. So it's, again, this idea that we have this very rigid conception of all these world religions, but the lines were very blurred and they didn't see themselves in the way that we see it now. So to conclude, if I had to summarize the essential points of the first three chapters, it's just that we kind of take this idea of religion to be very self-evident, or as the book says, simply exist. But this idea, especially of religions as very defined and rigid categories, and then also of the dichotomy between the religious and the secular, is something which is very modern, and throughout most of history would be an idea that's completely foreign to adherents of, whether it be a certain set of rituals or of the early movement of Islam of submitting to the din. Yeah, that's my.
Great.
So Professor Kroll asked me again to do this presentation, as you guys know. And this time I had 2 days to prepare, so I definitely had a bit more time. But
better be better.
Yeah, twice as good. But the second half is really a lot I found harder than the first half, so we'll see. And just another comment, I realized on the bus ride over here that there's a lot of names, and I didn't look up how to pronounce any of those names. So I wasn't very scrupulous, to use the word from last lecture, religio. So if you know how to pronounce the names and I butcher them too badly, you can budge in and tell me. So summary of last time, briefly went over the introduction, objective of the book, and then we defined the modern notion of religion, which is private, separate from the secular and the public, concerned with salvation of the individual. And then we looked at 3 examples of ancient words which are commonly translated as religion, religio, triskeia, and din, and how those terms don't really map onto our modern understanding of religion at all. And then I went over 2 instances when it's been taken to be the clear birth of a modern religion, and we talked about why that wasn't really the case, and I talked about Judaism and Islam. So some housekeeping first. On that last point of the birth of the modern notion of religion, he had 4 examples, and I went over 2, mostly just out of laziness, because 4 seemed like a lot. But then the more I read, I found that this example is important to what we're talking about today. So I'll just go over it very quickly. We have this guy, and this is one of the names I'm not sure how to pronounce, Eusebius. And the idea, the common historical narrative is that he has in his writings a clear articulation of world religion. So this is a historian saying Eusebius presents a clear articulation of Judaism, Hellenism, and Christianity as religions. But then the book goes on to argue that when he uses the words Judaismos, Hellenismos, and Christianity, he means something very different from what we mean today. So his actual goal in that book is to sort of redraw the ethnic mapping of Greece in order to make space for Christians as something which can kind of subsist under a Judaismus or a Hellenismus. So the idea is that you can be a Greek Christian or a Greek Jew or a Christian Jew. And so he says that Christianity is more of a citizenry of piety and a kind of philosophy, while the Greeks and the Jews is more rigidly an ethnic group. But still, he thinks that there is a sort of ethnic dimension to Christianity, to the philosophy, to the tradition. And he says that Christianity is sort of the oldest race because they sort of inherit the Hebrew tradition, and that kind of sets up the framework for this heresiological framework, which is what we're going to talk about a lot in the coming chapter. So that's what chapter 4 is mostly concerned with. It's called Christians and Others in the pre-modern era. And the main question that this chapter asks is, okay, since they didn't have this modern conception of religion as we see it today, how did other religions at the time conceptualize each other? So he goes over 3 examples: Manichaeism, how Christians viewed Muslims or the Ishmaelites, and then finally Buddhism. So first with Manichaeism, again, you see a lot in historical writings that this is the first real religion in the modern sense. So you have this historian saying is the first real religion in the modern sense because Mani the prophet established it deliberately and directly, and its scriptures and its rituals organized all in place. And interestingly, we didn't have much information on this religion, and all we knew about it was from hostile texts attacking it. But then with some excavation in the 20th century, we uncovered a lot of its text. So I'll go over briefly the history. So you have this guy, this prophet Mani, and he was born in Mesopotamia, grew up as part of a community of Baptists. And then at the age of 12, he started getting these visions. And then, he goes on proselytizing his message. And kind of central to his idea is that he is the heavenly comforter or advocate, which the Gospel of John claimed would be sent from heaven to teach Jesus' disciples. So he sees himself as a continuation of Christ's method, and that he's kind of imbued with the Holy Spirit. But he also kind of very strangely traces himself back through this very, very strange line of prophets that we wouldn't normally associate together. So he thinks that it starts with Zoroaster, the prophet of Zoroastrianism, and then Siddhartha Buddha, Jesus, and then finally Mani. And so for this notion that it's a self-conscious religion, the word that he uses in his text, so this is from one of the Manichaeistic texts, he says, the religion which has been chosen by me is in 10 things above and better than the other religions of the ancients. But the word here that he uses for religions is den, which is very similar to din, which we covered in the last class. And it has like so many meanings. It can mean community, church, wisdom, inner self, law, cosmology, kinship, even medicine. So again, it's not very clear that it's a self-conscious religion as we say it. And so to the question of how Christians reconciled this belief system with theirs, is they very much viewed Manichaeists as a heretical branch of Christianity. So this is a writing from a Christian at the time. He said, the madman Mani, named after his demonic heresy, pretended that he himself was Christ, announcing that he had the Holy Spirit within himself. And there's this idea that they're just Christians who are professing a heresy. And then on the flip side of that, the Manichaeistic view was that Christians were just Manichaeists who were in need of better teaching. And so they were the heretics, and they had the quote unquote true religion. So this is very different from how we view religion now, where it's like, if there's another religion, we don't see them as, oh no, they're just part of our group, but they're heretics, and we have to swerve them back towards us. But we do have an idea that they're just different. There's these rigid boundaries between religions. I mean, you kind of get a little fuzzy with like the Abrahamic religions, which we'll cover with John of Damascus and the Ishmaelites. So John of Damascus was this guy who who lived in Damascus, obviously, and he was one of the first Christians to provide an account of Muslims or the growing Muslim movement. And here's from his writings. There's also the powerful deceptive worship Treskeia of the Ishmaelites. For people who don't know, there's Abraham, who's like the father of Judaism. And then through Abraham, you get Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau, and then you trace that all the way down through the Jewish tradition, and then you eventually get the Christian tradition. But then Abraham also had a son called Ishmael, and then so you trace that down to Islam, which is the idea that he's saying here. So he's very much putting Islam within this Christian framework and saying that they're just heretics who, it's a heresy on Christianity, which again is different from the popular conceptualization of just these rigid boundaries. And then finally, and probably the most interesting example, we have how they dealt with the Buddha. So in 1580, you have Pope Gregory XIII, and he commissions an official list of Christian saints. And within that list, you have in India at the borders of Persia, the saints Barlaam and Joseph, whose wonderful deeds were recorded by Saint John of Damascus. And there's like a little summary of the story of Saint Joseph, and I'll just read it out to you guys, and I think you'll very quickly see where this is going. So in brief, the story of Barlaam and Joseph is as follows. At the same time as the rise of Christian monasticism in Egypt, many monks began to populate India, which had been exposed to Christianity through the work of the Apostle Thomas. At this time, a king called Abner rose to power. He was a non-Christian who was a successful military leader, enjoyed great wealth and a life of luxury. The one thing he deeply desired was a son, and eventually he did father a son, Joseph. After offering the god appropriate sacrifice as thanks, he consulted astrologers about the boy's future. They said he would be mighty and great, but the most learned astrologer predicted that the boy's greatness would be in a higher kingdom and that he would be a Christian. Abner had felt threatened by the growing number of Christian monks and had been persecuting them. Thus, he was intensely worried by this prophecy and wanted his son never to be exposed to Christians and their teachings. He therefore built a beautiful palace in a secluded city where the boy would be placed in order to avoid ever being exposed to death, disease, old age, poverty, or anything that might upset his happiness. In this atmosphere, Joseph grew up into a fine man of great intelligence. His learning, however, made him curious about the outside world, and he eventually asked the king to let him out and leave his sheltered palace. The king reluctantly allowed it. When Joseph ventured out, he was shocked upon seeing a blind man, a maimed man, and an old man who was near death. Joseph became deeply troubled at the time. An especially devout Christian monk received a revelation about Joseph's state and came in disguise to visit the prince. In a long dialogue, Barlaam imparted to Joseph the Christian message and informed of his father's persecution of the monks in India. Moved by Barlaam's speech, Joseph requested to be baptized and to join the monastic life. So this is, I'm sure as you guys know, almost exactly the story of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, of him being put in this secluded palace, and then he goes out, he sees the three sights, and that kind of completely shakes his life. So the Christian tradition has basically just ripped the story of Buddhism and fully incorporated it into theirs, and saying that he's a saint and that he's a Christian and he's being baptized instead of, whatever, meditating under the tree. And again, this is completely foreign from how we view religions today as these rigid categories where it's not very common that you'll have, like, especially once you get into the organized aspect of religion, someone ripping something from another religion. And just further on this point, the author is not exactly sure how this story ended up being incorporated to Christianity, but he is sure that it's not just a coincidence. And he traces like the name Joseph all the way back to Buddha through a variety of translations. So he is very certain about this. So just to conclude this chapter, I'll read a little bit of the conclusion. Groups that modern scholars discuss as different ancient religions did not discuss one another in that way. Instead, pre-modern people used strategies for articulating differences. For some Manichaeans, Christians were simply ill-informed Manichaeans in need of better teaching. And for most Catholic writers in the medieval period, the followers of Muhammad were heretical Christians. And then you have the story of Joseph just being taken and fully incorporated into Christianity. So this is where the book gets a little complicated. And when we dive deep into the diachronic narrative that this book is trying to paint of how we reached our current conception of religion. So just to remind you guys, the current conception is different systems of privately held beliefs about how individuals attain salvation separate from the secular, distinctly separate from the secular. So first you have Neoplatonists, which he credits as being the starting point for this transition into the modern conception. So you have this first guy, Marco Ficino, who gives his genealogy of true religion. So he traces what he calls true religion from Zoroaster. So again, prophet of Zoroastrianism, seen as the first, by some, the first monotheistic religion, traces it through Plato, then to Jesus, and he says, yes, this is the account of true religion. And his reasoning for this is that divine providence does not permit any region of the world at any time to be entirely without religion or true religion. So it's God would not let people in certain areas at certain times to not have a direct line or connection with him. So he provides this account, and it's not exactly clear how this is getting us closer to this modern conception, but it's in the sense that this is kind of the first time where you're seeing someone try to provide a unifying aspect of many species of religion under this genus of religion. So he's trying to find similarities among all these things, but we're still very far from the modern conception. For him, it's still very much a hierarchical thing with Christianity at the top, and there's very much degrees of quality the further removed you get from Christianity. And then that's where you get Giordano Bruno, who we talked a bit about during office hours. And he was basically just a more extreme Ficino, and he was burned at the stake for his beliefs. But for him, it wasn't, Christianity was not the pinnacle, and it was just another faith that was derivative of true religion. So after the Platonists, the Italian Neoplatonists, you get the English deists. So at the time, there was a lot of infighting within the church. You have the Catholic Church and then the Protestants, and then the Protestants segmenting into a lot of different sects. And this is kind of illustrated by the book through this very long book title that was written at the time. So in 1606, you get this book by Oliver Ormerod, and I'll just read a bit of the title because it's like a huge title. But he says, "The picture of a papist, or a revelation or a relation of the damnable heresies, detestable qualities, and diabolical practices of sundry heretics in former ages, and of the papists in this age, wherein is plainly shewed that there is scarce any heresy which the ancient church knew, and withal condemned to the pits of hell, which the Romish church hath not raked up again and propounded to the world with a new varnish and fresh color." So, they're very angry at each other. And the book title goes on. So you're starting to get some confusion, because now that you don't have this one monolithic authority, people are like, okay, so then how do we know how to attain salvation? Where do we look to? And then you get this guy, Edward Lord Herbert of Cherbury, and he tries to come up with, okay, what is the lowest common denominator of religion, which ties all true religions together? And he comes up with these 5 points. 1, that there is one supreme God. 2, that he ought to be worshipped. 3, that virtue and piety are the chief parts of divine worship. 4, that we ought to be sorry for our sins and repent for them, and that divine goodness doth dispense rewards and punishment in this life and after it. And he says that this is what constitutes a religion. And this may seem not very inclusive, and it's not very inclusive, but it is definitely at least a little more inclusive than it seems, because, for example, he would include the Greeks' Hellenistic practices under this, because he says, like, oh, when they worship the sun, for example, they're not being so stupid as to just worship the sun, but the sun represents the one supreme God. So he does extend this charitability. So now we're getting a more concrete look at religion as a genus with species underneath it. And but we're still very far from this private and public divide, which is so important to current day discourse on religion. And that's when you get Jean Bodin and Jean Locke. So Jean Bodin, his ideas of pragmatic states. So he sees that religion can be a huge problem and can be very divisive within establishing a cohesive state, but it can also be a stabilizer. So how does he reconcile these two facts? He says, well, people can have their beliefs about religion, but it should be the discourse around it should be left private to avoid disruption in the public. And for the first time also, you get an articulation of like modern pluralism. So in one of his books, Bowden writes that discussions about different creeds was to be a matter of the private sphere. In such a situation, multiple creedal affiliations could exist peacefully under a single dominating state government. And the book says that this is a completely novel idea of religious pluralism under a state. And then with Locke, you get this even more cemented, where he goes as far as to describe the church as a private, individual affair. For him, churches are voluntary, private societies that individuals can choose to join or choose not to join. So now, we're slowly forming towards this modern idea of religion, and we're pretty much almost there. So just to conclude, start with the Neoplatonists, who give kind of a very vague outline of genus and species, and then you get that more rigidly defined with the deists, and then you get a private public with John Locke and Jean Bodin or Bowden, and that pretty much sums up chapter 5. Now we're left with the question of, this has been very much centered around the Christian world, but how do we get this idea of world religions in various other places? And what the book argues is that what generates like a concept of religion that is so similar to ours in other places is pretty much colonial interactions. So he goes through 3 examples: religion in India, religion in Africa, and religion in Japan. And I'll focus on India and Japan. So first, for religion in India, the term Hinduism comes from so there's the people of the Indus River, and then you get the Hindus, and then they're like, okay, they have different beliefs than us, so we'll just designate this Hinduism. And then you get this guy Henry Lord, and he goes and he's trying to gather a concrete account of the doctrine of this Hinduism that they've just coined. And so he talks to the Brahmins, and he translates this thing which he calls the book of their laws, which is the Shastra. And in doing this, his goal was very much to find the Bible of Hinduism. But what has been revealed, in scholarship since, is that Hinduism does not really have a book which is equivalent to the Bible. So he's very much imposing his Christian Protestant understanding of religion into the Hindus. And then, so with this book, they generate a book of Hindu laws, and then through that, Christian missionaries attack the Hindu doctrine based on these books that they've generated. And then in response, to defend the tradition, Hinduism slowly molds over time to appear something which is closer to Christian Protestantism, whether it be structurally or how they place greater emphasis on texts, when in the past that wasn't the case. And that's why the book takes a great issue with this notion that Hinduism is an ancient religion that still flourishes, because the idea of religion is a modern notion that only really develops with colonial interaction. And then you get Shintoism in Japan. So you have the narrative that Shinto is the name given to the traditional religion of Japan, the religion that has existed continuously from the founding of the Japanese nation to the present. But this is not at all how it was historically. Shinto is kind of more esoteric and less concrete than that, and it's completely compatible with Buddhism previously. Like you could be a Shinto Buddhism. It's more just a lens through which you can look through the world. And then after the shogunate, you have the Meiji Restoration, where they're trying to get rid of foreign religious influence, and then they start persecuting Buddhists and whatever, and you get this idea that no, Shintoism is its own religion opposed to Buddhism, and it's developing in response to this new notion of world religions that has again developed in the West. So with Shinto, then we have a clear example of the creation of a religion specifically to fit the model of world religion. Shinto is neither ancient, unchanging, nor peculiarly indigenous. Various parties use the designation Shinto to represent various things throughout the history of Japan. So now we pretty much have gotten the complete picture of this modern idea of religion, first with Neoplatonists and the deists providing this development of the genus of religion. And then you have John Locke and Bodine with the public and private distinction. And then you have the creation of world religions through colonialism. And sort of the final nail in the coffin is the writings of Otto and William James, both of which we covered in class. And James writes, religion shall mean for us the feeling and acts of experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. So hyper-individualistic, hyper concerned with just the individual salvation, very a private affair. And then you have Otto's phenomenological account, which we covered, of the numinous, reducing religion to just a feeling that is had in the believer. And that pretty much sums up the diachronic narrative that the book gives. And then we're just left with chapter 7, which goes into how this notion of religion became sort of naturalized or made to seem that it's always been the case. And then the conclusion with just a few concluding remarks. Yeah, that's pretty much the bulk of it.